Did you know that the world's second largest country could have been called Tuponia? Or Borealia? Maybe Hochelaga? No, seriously, the story of how Canada got its name is a real thriller with kidnappings, cultural misunderstandings, and even tragedies. So sit back and get comfortable, because we're about to discover why the second largest country in the world is called Canada. So, 1535, French explorer Jacques Cartier is sailing up the St. Lawrence River. With him on board are two young Iroquois men, Teoni and Domagaya. And then they see familiar territory and start excitedly shouting and pointing, "Canada! Canada!" Cartier hears this word and thinks, "Oh, cool, this must be the name of all this land." But no, the guys were just saying, "There's the village, there's the settlement," because the word Kanata in the Huron Iroquois language meant exactly that, a village or settlement. They were pointing to the specific village of Stadacona, where Quebec City stands today. Imagine this. You arrive in a foreign country, point at a house and ask, "What's this place called?" And a local says, "House." And you're like, "Aha, got it. So this whole country is called House." That's basically what happened with Canada. But wait, the story gets even more interesting. These two guys, Teoni and Domagaya, weren't just traveling with Cartier for fun. A year earlier in 1534, he had kidnapped them. Yes, during his first voyage, Cartier captured them along with their chief, Donnacona, then released the chief but took the sons to France. And now, a year later, he's bringing them back home. They were the ones showing him the way to their village of Stadacona. When Cartier arrived at the village in September 1535, the locals greeted him with dancing and singing, but the joy was premature. During the winter of 1535-1536, scurvy broke out among the French, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. A quarter of Cartier's crew died. The local inhabitants saved the rest by teaching them to make a brew from a tree they called Aneta, probably spruce. This brew contained vitamin C and saved the French lives. But along with the French came European diseases. That same winter, over 50 residents of Stadacona died from viral and bacterial infections against which they had no immunity. And how did Cartier repay them for saving his life? In the spring, he captured Donnacona, both his sons, and 7 other village residents and took them to France. Of the 10 kidnapped, 9 died in France. None returned home. But let's get back to the name. In his journal, Cartier clearly wrote, "They call a town Canada." He understood what the word meant, but at the same time he began using it to describe not just the village of Stadacona, but the entire territory controlled by Chief Donnacona. He named the St. Lawrence River Rivière du Canada, the Canada River, and this name stuck until the early 1600s. By 1547, on European maps, the word Canada was already being used to designate the entire territory north of the St. Lawrence River. At first, it was a small area, but over time, French explorers and fur traders pushed west and south, and the territory of Canada grew. By the early 1700s, the name referred to all French lands in what is now the American Midwest, and even southern lands where Louisiana is today. Interestingly, by the mid-16th century, French colonists born in the colony began calling themselves Canadiens, Canadians. At first, it was just a geographic adjective, Canadian land, Canadian climate, Canadian goods. But gradually, it became a marker of identity. A Canadien was someone who was born in the colony or had lived there for a long time as opposed to newcomers from France. It was a new identity based on the realities of colonial life. And here's the interesting part. Just as French colonists appropriated this name for themselves, they stopped using it for the indigenous population. In 1763, everything changed. The British conquered New France. In 1791, they divided what they had previously called the province of Quebec into 2 separate regions, Lower Canada, predominantly French-speaking, and Upper Canada, predominantly English-speaking. French-speaking residents continued to call themselves Canadians, and British colonists weren't quick to adopt the name at first, but by the mid-19th century, English colonists also began calling themselves Canadians. In 1841, the two Canadas united into one province of Canada, and it was this name that survived until Confederation. Now we're getting to the most interesting part. When talks began in the 1860s about uniting the British colonies in North America, the question arose, what should we call the new country? And that's when a real brainstorming session began. People suggested all kinds of options. Albert's Land, in honor of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. Albionora, Albion of the North. Albion is an ancient name for Britain. Borealia, from the Latin borealis, meaning northern. Sounds beautiful, right? Britannia, in honor of Britain, of course. Cabotia, after Italian explorer John Cabot, who explored the East Coast. Colonia, simply colony. Ifisga, this one's a masterpiece, an acronym for England, France, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Aboriginal lands. Try saying that 3 times fast. Hochelaga, the name of an Iroquois village that Cartier visited in 1535, where Montreal is now. Laurentia, a geological name for part of North America. Mesopelagia, land between the seas. Norland, simply northern land. Superior, after Lake Superior. Transatlantia, across the ocean. Tuponia, or Tupana, an acrostic from the United Provinces of North America. Ursalia, place of bears. Vesperia, from Roman mythology, land of the evening star. Victoria Land, in honor of Queen Victoria. Even Walter Bagehot, editor of the London newspaper The Economist, argued that the new nation should be called Northland or Anglia instead of Canada. And then on February 9, 1865, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, one of the fathers of Confederation, took the stage. He gave a speech that settled everything. I read in one newspaper not less than a dozen attempts to derive a new name. One individual chooses Tuponia and another Hochelaga as a suitable name for the new nationality. Now I ask any honorable member of this House how he would feel if he woke up some fine morning and found himself, instead of a Canadian, a Tuponian or a Hochelagander. Imagine it. Hi, I'm a Tuponian. Or, I'm a proud Hochelagander. Doesn't sound great, does it? Thanks to McGee's wit and the delegates' common sense, on July 1, 1867, the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick united into one dominion under the name of Canada. Dominion instead of kingdom. By the way, an interesting detail. They initially planned to call the new country the Kingdom of Canada. But the Americans had just been through a civil war, and the British feared that the word kingdom would provoke a negative reaction from their neighbors. So they chose the word dominion. This word had been used for centuries to designate lands owned by a monarch. Thus, the new country became the Dominion of Canada. However, after World War II, as Canada became increasingly independent, the full name, Dominion of Canada, was used less and less. And in 1982, when Canada gained full independence and its own constitution, the official name finally became simply Canada. But not everyone was thrilled with the name Canada. In the maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, many resisted this term. They felt that Canada belonged to central provinces like Ontario and Quebec, not to them. Canadians
were from away. In the 20th century, new tensions emerged. During the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s in Quebec, French-Canadian identity changed. Instead of Canadien Français, French-Canadian, many began calling themselves Québécois, Quebecer. Other regional variants appeared: Franco-Ontarian, Franco-Manitoban. Many Francophones rejected Canada as a federal project that didn't represent them. At the same time, Indigenous peoples increasingly refused the label Canadian. For many, to call themselves Indigenous Canadians meant accepting a colonial framework imposed by a state that had long denied them citizenship and continues to challenge their rights. Many today prefer to describe themselves as Indigenous peoples living in Canada, not of Canada. At the same time, immigration transformed the meaning of Canadian. Newcomers from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East embraced the name, weaving it into their own identities and adding new cultural threads to the national tapestry. Today, being Canadian is as much about plurality, diversity, and the tensions and contradictions of belonging as it is about the depth of shared historical experience. Why Canada and not Canadia? By the way, many people wonder, why Canada and not Canadia? Why not like America from United States of America? The thing is, Canada and America were not named after the same Roman goddess. That's a popular myth. America is named after Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose name cartographer Martin Waldseemler used on a map in 1507. And Canada comes from that same Iroquois word, Kanata, meaning village. It's not a name, not a Latin word, and not the name of a mythical character. It's just a local word for settlement. The form Canada is how Cartier transcribed the sound of the word Kanata in French. It's simply stuck in that form on maps and in documents, and no one ever added Latin suffixes like ia to it. And what happened to that very village of Stadacona where it all started? The story here is sad. When Cartier returned in 1531, 5 years after kidnapping Donnacona and the others, he found the village abandoned and destroyed. Scholars believe that the St. Lawrence Iroquoians who lived there disappeared due to several reasons: European diseases that killed a significant portion of the population, wars with southern Iroquois, especially the Mohawks, possibly attacks by Inuit and Algonquins, poor harvests due to climate changes. When Samuel de Champlain arrived at this site in 1603, almost 70 years later, the Stadaconans and other St. Lawrence Iroquoians were gone. The St. Lawrence Valley had become a battleground for Montagna and Iroquois raids. Where exactly the village of Stadacona was located is still unknown. Archaeologists have never found its traces. It's believed to have been near the confluence of the St. Lawrence and St. Charles rivers in the area of present-day Quebec City. However, there is evidence that refugees from Stadacona and Hochelaga were accepted by the Huron-Wendat, so perhaps their descendants are alive today. Over the years, people have come up with various alternative theories about the origin of the name Canada. The most popular is that Portuguese or Spanish explorers, having visited the north of the continent and not finding gold and silver, wrote "Ca nada," meaning nothing here in Portuguese, or "Acá nada," aquí nada in Spanish. Sounds cool, right? But there's no historical evidence of such interaction between Iberians and Iroquois. Also, in Cartier's records, there's no mention of him hearing about any Spanish or Portuguese name for this region. So, this theory is most likely just a beautiful legend. Enjoyed the video? Hit that like button and subscribe. There's much more coming.